He bought an old suitcase at a flea market, never imagining that inside was a secret that would make him cry and change his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning began with that peculiar heaviness found only in southern towns that have forgotten their own rhythm. The sun had not yet climbed fully over the rooftops, but the air already carried the weight of dust, humidity, and the faint smell of tar from the cracked road outside. In the small neglected house at the end of Maple Street, a man named Elijah sat at his kitchen table, staring at the wall clock that refused to tick in time. His coffee had long gone cold, yet he kept his hands around the mug as though it were a lifeline. Since losing his job at the shipping yard 3 months ago, time had stopped making sense. Each morning bled into the next, and every day carried the same stale flavor of waiting for something undefined to happen. The house had once belonged to his grandfather, a man whose hands had known the rhythm of labor, whose life had carried structure and purpose. Elijah often wondered what his grandfather would have thought of him now. A man adrift, divorced, unemployed, sitting in silence among peeling paint and crooked picture frames. The only sounds were the soft creaks of wood expanding in the heat and the occasional buzz of a fly trapped between the window and the torn curtain. He looked around the kitchen, at the half-empty bottle of bourbon on the counter, at the stack of unopened envelopes, and felt that strange, dull pressure in his chest that came from knowing you were alive, but not truly living. When the clock's minute hand dragged itself closer to 9, Elijah stood and reached for his worn jacket. There was no reason to go anywhere, yet staying inside felt suffocating. The house had begun to echo with his thoughts, and he needed noise, color, movement, anything that might remind him the world hadn't stopped. He stepped outside into the pale sunlight and began walking without direction. His boots hit the cracked pavement with a dry rhythm, carrying him through the quiet streets where lawns grew wild and shutters hung half loose from their frames. He didn't realize where his feet were taking him until he began to hear the sounds: shouts, laughter, the metallic clatter of folding tables being set up. The flea market had sprung to life at the edge of town, just beyond the abandoned rail yard. Every Saturday, vendors arrived before dawn to stake their places, spreading their wares across weathered blankets and rickety tables. It was a world of forgotten things: rusted bicycles, chipped dishes, faded photographs, cracked mirrors, old coins whose faces had been worn to anonymity. Elijah had been there before, years ago with his ex-wife, when life had still held some ease. Now, drawn by something like restlessness, he drifted toward the sound of voices. The market was already crowded. Rows of tents shimmered in the morning heat like sails of a ragged fleet. The smell of fried dough mingled with gasoline and old paper. A woman was selling records from a crate marked 50 cents, and the faint strains of jazz spilled from a nearby radio. Children darted between stalls clutching melted ice cream cones, their laughter cutting through the low hum of bargaining voices. For a moment, Elijah felt himself dissolve into that movement, part of the human tide that gathered each week to trade not only objects but fragments of their own pasts. He walked slowly, his gaze sweeping across tables piled with the detritus of other lives. There were pocket watches stopped at forgotten hours, typewriters with keys that no longer pressed, dolls missing eyes, boxes of mismatched photographs where smiling strangers looked out from another century. Elijah had always thought of flea markets as strange museums, places where memory became tangible, where the anonymous weight of history was stacked and priced for casual hands to touch. He didn't need anything. He didn't even know why he came. Yet, as he moved deeper into the maze of stalls, he felt something pulling him forward. He stopped at a table covered with old luggage. Most of it was junk, cracked vinyl, broken locks, cloth eaten by moths, but one piece caught his eye. A deep blue suitcase, leather darkened with age, its brass corners dulled to a soft amber hue. It was larger than the others, heavier looking, though the handle was frayed and one of the buckles hung loose. A small tag dangled from the side, its edges curled and brown. The ink had bled into the paper, but Elijah could still make out a name written in careful script, L. Morgan. Beneath it, a faint number, perhaps a train ticket or a military code. The vendor, an older white man with a face weathered by years of sun, noticed Elijah studying the suitcase. "Found that one up in the attic of the old station," he said, his voice slow and gravelly. "Was gonna toss it, but figured someone might want it for the look of it. Pretty thing, huh? From back when people still traveled in style." Elijah nodded absently. He ran his hand over the leather, feeling the dryness of it beneath his fingers. It was rough, cracked, yet still solid. Something about the suitcase stirred a quiet unease in him, like a whisper just out of hearing. "How much?" he asked. The vendor shrugged. "Give me $10 and it's yours. Ain't worth more than that. Probably empty." $10 was a small price for curiosity. Elijah handed over the crumpled bills without another word. The man wrapped a bit of twine around the handle for easier carrying and turned to the next customer. Elijah stood there a moment longer, the weight of the suitcase pulling at his arm, heavier than he expected. It felt as though it contained more than just air and dust. It carried the gravity of time. He left the market as the sun climbed higher, the chatter fading behind him. His path wound through narrow streets, past the boarded windows of the old train depot, and toward the outskirts where the houses thinned. The suitcase thumped softly against his leg as he walked. He couldn't shake the odd feeling that it had chosen him rather than the other way around. By the time he reached home, the day had turned hot. He set the suitcase on the kitchen table and poured himself a glass of water. For several minutes he simply looked at it. Dust motes drifted through the sunlight slanting across the room, and in their slow dance he felt the same suspended stillness that had filled his days since losing everything that once anchored him. Yet now, for the first time in months, there was something, small, uncertain, but real, that stirred his attention. He told himself he would open it later, after lunch, but he couldn't walk away. There was a kind of quiet magnetism about the object, a patience that waited for him to act. He sat down, resting his hands on either side of it, feeling the coolness of the brass latches. He imagined the person who had once carried it, someone who had stood on a station platform, ticket in hand, watching the horizon shimmer in the heat. Who had packed these belongings? Where had they gone? And why had this thing been left behind for strangers to find decades later? Elijah unlatched one corner, then hesitated. The tiny click echoed unnaturally loud in the silence of the kitchen. He closed it again, heart beating faster than it should. He told himself it was ridiculous to feel nervous, but there it was. A sense that he was trespassing on something sacred, that by opening it he might disturb a story that had long since ended. He pushed the suitcase aside and stood up. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of a train horn. It was faint, almost swallowed by the hum of the town, but it made him pause. He turned toward the window, half expecting to see something move beyond the trees, though the tracks had been abandoned for years. He laughed quietly to himself, shaking off the unease. Still, when he turned back to the suitcase, it seemed to have changed. not in shape but in presence, heavier, more insistent. That night, as darkness settled over the neighborhood, Elijah sat alone in his living room. The suitcase remained on the table, its dull surface catching the dim light from the lamp. The house creaked softly as the air cooled. He poured another drink but didn't touch it, staring instead at the brass latches glinting faintly in the dark. There was something almost alive in the way it reflected the light, like an eye half open, watching. He thought of how small the transaction had been. A few words, a handful of money exchanged for something no one else wanted. And yet, as he sat there, he felt that the suitcase had brought with it a quiet gravity, a thread connecting him to people he had never met. He wondered who L. Morgan had been. Perhaps a traveling salesman, perhaps a soldier, perhaps a woman running from something. The possibilities spun through his mind until they blurred together, until he began to feel that familiar pull toward stories not his own, the way he always did when he picked up old photographs or forgotten letters at markets. But this felt different, closer, heavier, as though the story inside waited not just to be found, but to be finished. Eventually he rose, carried the suitcase into his small bedroom, and set it on the dresser. The moonlight spilled across it through the blinds, silvering its cracked surface. Elijah undressed slowly, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling. The silence pressed close, yet within it he could almost hear something faint, a whisper of paper shifting, or perhaps only his imagination. He turned over, closing his eyes, but the image of the blue suitcase lingered behind them. When sleep finally came, it was uneasy and shallow. He dreamed of trains pulling away from stations, of crowds waving at platforms swallowed by steam, of a woman's voice calling a name he could not catch. Each time he reached for her, she faded into smoke, leaving behind only the echo of that name, Morgan, and the color blue. He woke before dawn, sweat on his forehead, heart pounding. The house was still. The first light crept through the window, laying soft stripes across the floorboards. He sat up and looked toward the dresser. The suitcase sat there, unchanged, patient, as though it had been waiting through the night. Elijah swung his legs out of bed and rubbed his face with both hands. He didn't know what drew him so powerfully toward this object, only that it had unsettled something long dormant inside him. The emptiness that had filled his life these past months now had a shape, a weight, a name written in fading ink. He stood and crossed the room. His fingers brushed the handle, cool from the night air. For a moment, he thought he heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing in some far corridor of his mind, the rhythmic tap of shoes on a station platform. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and told himself he was being foolish. It was just an old suitcase. But even as he said it, he knew he was lying. The suitcase had found him, and deep down he sensed that it was not finished speaking. When he left for work that no longer existed, for errands he no longer had, for a day that meant nothing, he knew he would return to it before nightfall, and when he did, he would open it. Whatever lay inside, dust, photographs, ghosts, it was waiting. The morning light grew brighter, crawling over the floor, touching the walls, and finally glinting off the brass corners of the suitcase. Elijah turned away, but the thought stayed with him as he moved through the empty house, haunting him like the echo of a train that no longer ran. He didn't realize it yet, but that single moment, the decision to take home what no one else wanted, had already shifted the course of his life. The blue suitcase sat in the quiet room like a held breath, patient and expectant, its secrets folded neatly within. Outside, the town awoke to another ordinary day, but inside that house, the first faint movement of destiny had begun. Morning came pale and uncertain, its light leaking gently through the blinds and spreading across the small room like a hesitant hand. The air was still heavy with the scent of the previous night, old dust, faint whiskey, and the cool tang of dawn creeping in from the open window. Elijah sat on the edge of his bed for a long while, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the suitcase that waited on the dresser. It sat there in the dim light like something that did not belong entirely to this world. The leather, cracked and dry, seemed to absorb the glow rather than reflect it, and the brass corners were dulled to the color of tired gold. It looked no different from how it had the night before, yet it held a kind of quiet insistence, as though it had spent the dark hours watching him breathe, patient and waiting for the courage that morning would bring. He rubbed his eyes and let out a slow breath. The dream still clung to him. The woman's voice calling a name from across the fog of a station, the color blue spreading like smoke over the tracks. It was nonsense, he told himself, a trick of an overactive mind, fueled by whiskey and the weight of curiosity. But even as he tried to dismiss it, a part of him felt that the dream had not entirely come from him. It was as if the suitcase had whispered it into his sleep. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the same stubborn clock. Elijah poured coffee, though it tasted burnt, and set the cup beside the suitcase as though he were about to share breakfast with an old companion. He sat opposite it, hands resting flat on the table. The leather was cool beneath his palms, smooth in places, rough in others. He could feel the brittleness of age in it, the way it resisted touch yet yielded slightly, like something that had once been alive and had not entirely forgotten how to breathe. He thought again of the name on the tag, L. Morgan. The handwriting had been elegant once, deliberate and steady. It was the sort of writing that belonged to another era, the age of ink and patience. The faint number beneath it, perhaps a train ticket or identification, was almost illegible now. Elijah wondered who had written it, whether it had been the owner's hand or someone else labeling it for her. He reached for the latches, hesitated, then opened them. The sound they made was not loud, but sharp, like the breaking of some invisible seal. The air that escaped was faintly scented, something dry and floral, like lavender faded by decades. He lifted the lid slowly, half expecting to find only dust or moth-eaten fabric. But what lay inside was something far more deliberate, far more human. The first thing he noticed was how carefully everything had been arranged. A man's wool suit, neatly folded, still holding faint creases as though waiting for a journey that never began. Beneath it, a woman's dress, pale cream once, now yellowed with age. Its fabric shimmered faintly in the light, the threadbare silk soft against his fingertips. There was a faint smell to it, not unpleasant, but old, like the air of a sealed trunk opened for the first time in generations. Beneath the layers of clothing, something smaller, a pair of children's shoes no larger than his hand. The sight of them caught him unprepared. He stared at them for a long moment, the room around him shrinking into silence. He began to lift the items out carefully, one by one, laying them on the table as though unwrapping something sacred. Beneath the clothes lay an old train ticket, the ink nearly faded to invisibility. The destination line had been smudged, but the date remained legible, September 1943. He traced the printed words with a finger, imagining the journey it had promised. There was also a small notebook, its leather cover cracked, tied shut with a frayed ribbon. A family photograph had been tucked beneath it. He turned it toward the light and studied the image. A man stood in the photograph, tall and lean, wearing a dark uniform with the insignia of a railway worker. Beside him, a woman in a light-colored dress smiled faintly, her hand resting on the shoulder of a little boy who clutched a wooden toy train. The photograph had faded to sepia, but the clarity of their faces was still there. The man's quiet pride, the woman's mixture of joy and worry, the boy's innocent curiosity. Elijah felt a tightening in his chest as he stared. They were strangers, yet there was something in their posture, their eyes, that stirred a sense of recognition he couldn't explain. He set the photo down and opened the notebook. Its first pages were blank, but as he turned them, faint ink began to appear, a list of numbers and expenses, groceries, train fares, wages. The handwriting was precise, the kind of neatness born from discipline. Near the end of the notebook, tucked between pages, he found a folded scrap of paper that had been written on both sides in the same careful hand. The words were brief, a message written in haste. "If I do not make it, take the boy north. Tell him never to forget where he came from." The paper trembled slightly in his hand as he read it. It was unsigned. He sat back, staring at the items spread before him. The room seemed to hum faintly, though the only sound was the distant chirp of cicadas outside. He felt the uncanny sensation that he had walked into someone else's memory, and that it had somehow been waiting for him. He picked up the photograph again. The boy's eyes seemed to meet his, as if seeing him through the decades. Among the clothes, he noticed something else, a sealed envelope tucked beneath the lining. Its edges had been darkened by time, and it bore a faint wax seal that had cracked slightly but still held. The paper was thick, the kind that had once been reserved for letters of importance. There was no address, no stamp, only a name written in elegant, looping script, Thomas. He held it up to the light, and the faint outline of handwriting showed through. He wanted to open it immediately, to know what it said, but something stopped him. The seal, the neatness, the dignity of the script. It felt like trespass to break it. He closed the suitcase and sat back, staring at the items he had uncovered. Every piece seemed to tell part of a story, yet none of them gave away the ending. The photograph showed a family, the note hinted at separation, and the envelope held a silence that felt heavier than words. He thought of his own life, how easily things had fallen apart, how quietly people could vanish from one another without warning. Maybe whoever owned this suitcase had lived through something similar, something worse. The world in 1943 had not been kind to people who looked like him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. He left the suitcase open on the table, unable to close it, as though it might breathe if given air. Each time he passed through the room, his eyes were drawn to it. The soft folds of the dress, the stiff fabric of the suit, the shoes so small they seemed like a whisper of a life cut short. The items didn't merely sit there. They radiated something: presence, grief, memory. By evening, the light slanted across the room in long stripes, touching the brass corners of the suitcase and setting them aglow like dying embers. Elijah cooked a simple dinner, but couldn't eat much. He found himself standing in the doorway, watching the suitcase from a distance as though afraid to disturb it. When darkness fell, he turned on the lamp, and the soft yellow light turned the photograph on the table into something almost alive. The woman's faint smile seemed to deepen in the glow, her eyes holding the same quiet courage that reminded him of old family photos of his grandmother. But this woman wasn't her. Couldn't be her, and yet something about the curve of the cheek, the softness of expression, something felt familiar. He sat again, elbows on his knees, chin resting on his clasped hands. He wondered about the family's story. Had they made their journey north? Had they escaped whatever danger they feared? The letter with the name Thomas must have been meant for someone left behind, or someone waiting. He imagined a train platform at dusk, steam rising in ghostly veils, the woman clutching the boy's hand as the whistle sounded. The suitcase beside her, packed carefully for a new life that never began. He could almost see her looking back one last time, torn between leaving and staying. That night, he dreamed again, though he couldn't later recall all the details. There was a station. He knew that much, the same one from before, shrouded in mist. He saw the woman again, standing near a pillar, the suitcase at her feet. Her eyes searched the crowd as though for someone she knew was not coming. When their eyes met, he felt the weight of her gaze settle on him. She did not speak, but she lifted her hand, and in it was the envelope sealed in wax. Then the scene dissolved into smoke and wind. He woke with his heart hammering, the faint echo of a train whistle in his ears, though none had passed this town in years. The room was cold despite the southern summer. The suitcase remained where it had been, half open, its contents spilling softly into the world. Elijah rose and poured water over his face at the sink. He looked into the mirror and saw the same weary man he always did, yet something had shifted in his expression, an alertness, a quiet gravity. The suitcase had awakened something in him that he couldn't define. Not fear, not hope, but a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He returned to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down before the suitcase. This time he reached for the envelope. The wax seal cracked under his thumb, releasing the faint scent of old paper and ink. He unfolded the letter slowly. The handwriting was beautiful, sweeping, unmistakably feminine. "Thomas," it began, "if you ever read this, it means I have done what I had to do. The nights have grown long here, and the air carries a silence I can no longer bear. They say the trains will still run north through the end of the month, though not for much longer. I cannot wait any more. I will take Samuel with me and pray that we reach safety. Do not look for us. It will be too dangerous. Remember what you promised, that if we were parted, you would keep faith. Tell him, if I am gone, that I loved him more than life. Tell him never to forget his name." Elijah read the words twice, 3 times, until they blurred together. The ink had faded in places, but the emotion behind it was still raw, pulsing beneath the surface. He imagined the woman sitting at a table like his, perhaps under the same kind of lamplight, pen trembling in her hand as she wrote those words. She must have known what she was risking, what it meant to flee in those years. Her handwriting carried a quiet desperation, but also strength. She hadn't written in panic. She had written with purpose. He folded the letter carefully and set it beside the photograph. There was no signature at the end, only a small mark, an initial, perhaps an L, drawn with deliberate flourish. L. Morgan. Outside, the day had begun to fade again. Shadows lengthened across the floor, swallowing the light in slow waves. Elijah sat in the dimness, his thoughts spinning like the dust in the air. The letter had not given him answers, only more questions. Who had Thomas been? Had he ever received the letter? Why had the suitcase remained behind if she had left? And where had she gone, this woman who wrote with such steady grace in the face of fear? As darkness deepened, Elijah felt a strange sense of connection to her, as though through the letter she had chosen him to finish something left undone. The house no longer felt empty. It was filled with the breath of memory, with the quiet hum of stories pressing to be heard. He gathered the items back into the suitcase, carefully, reverently, until only the photograph remained on the table. He couldn't bring himself to put it away. Instead, he propped it against the lamp where the woman's face caught the faint glow. He poured himself another drink but did not taste it. His mind was full of voices that were not his own, the soft cadence of a letter written in haste, the murmur of a child's laughter from a photograph, the echo of a train whistle fading into fog. He sat there until long after midnight, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock and the whisper of wind through the open window. When he finally rose and went to bed, the suitcase lay closed once more, but the air around it seemed to vibrate faintly, like something alive. Elijah paused in the doorway, looking back one last time before turning off the light. He knew he would dream again, and this time he would not try to wake too soon. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance a train sounded, a sound that should have been impossible in this sleeping town, but which in that moment felt entirely real. Elijah lay awake, eyes open in the dark, thinking of the woman who had written her final words to a man who might never have read them. The suitcase had given him her voice, but not her ending, and he understood now that he would have no rest until he found it. The last thought before sleep claimed him was that maybe, just maybe, the suitcase had not been waiting to be opened. It had been waiting to be understood, and for reasons he could not yet explain, it had chosen him for that task. The next morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that blurred the edges of everything it touched. Elijah sat at the kitchen table again, the suitcase still before him like an anchor that had fastened itself to his life. He had barely slept. The letter he had read the night before replayed in his mind in fragments, its phrases circling like the persistent rhythm of the ticking clock on the wall. "Do not look for us," she had written. "Tell him never to forget his name." There was something haunting in those words, not just in their desperation, but in their certainty. She had written them as if she knew she would vanish, as if her story would one day need to be found by someone else entirely. He poured himself coffee, but didn't drink it. Outside, a thin fog rolled across the street, softening the shapes of the houses beyond. It was a small town that rarely changed, yet that morning it felt altered in some quiet, imperceptible way. Perhaps it was simply that Elijah himself had changed. The previous day he had been a man adrift, haunted only by his own failures. Now he was something else, still adrift but tethered to a thread that reached back through time. He reached for the letter again and read it in full, letting his eyes linger on every curve of the handwriting. The name Thomas at the top had taken on weight. He imagined the man who might have been Thomas, perhaps a husband, perhaps a brother, perhaps the one who had been left behind to carry the memory. The way she wrote his name had tenderness in it, but also distance, as though the words themselves were an apology. Elijah read it aloud, softly, testing the sound of it. The name seemed to echo faintly against the stillness of the kitchen. He began to think of the woman, L. Morgan, the name on the suitcase, the signature at the end of the letter. Who had she been? The letter's date placed it in the midst of the war years, when trains still carved through the South like veins carrying people toward promises that sometimes vanished as quickly as they appeared. There were hints in her words of flight, of fear, of danger from which she had no protection but her resolve. Elijah thought of what it must have been like for a woman of color in those years, burdened with a child and the weight of a secret that might have been too dangerous to name. He unfolded the photograph again, studying the three faces captured in the fading sepia. The man's uniform was that of a railway worker, the insignia faint but recognizable. The woman stood beside him, her smile so subtle it might have been mistaken for sadness. The boy clutched the small wooden toy train in his hand. Elijah noticed the boy's eyes again, dark, round, bright with innocence, and for a fleeting instant he felt something like recognition, as though those eyes had followed him through the decades. He took out his phone and snapped careful photos of the items: the letter, the photograph, the train ticket, the suitcase itself. It felt strange, almost sacrilegious to digitize such fragile relics, yet he knew it was the only way to begin searching. The internet had never played much of a role in his life beyond bills and idle news, but now it became the first thread in his search for the truth. He began simply, type in L. Morgan, 1943 train, south to north, into the search bar, half expecting nothing. The results were a blur of irrelevant pages, long lists of genealogical records, and advertisements for ancestry websites. He refined the search, adding words: railway worker, missing family, wartime letters. Nothing matched. Yet he could not stop. Every new page he opened felt like turning another stone in a field that stretched endlessly ahead. Hours passed unnoticed. The coffee went cold again, the sunlight faded to a softer tone, and the day outside drifted into afternoon. At some point, Elijah found a digital archive of local newspapers. The library had uploaded issues dating back nearly a century. He scrolled through yellowed headlines until his eyes burned, tracing columns of text that spoke of old wars, rationing, civic meetings, and births. And then, almost by accident, he found a brief paragraph buried near the bottom of a September issue from 1943. Local woman and child reported missing after planned journey north. Mrs. Lorraine Morgan, wife of railway employee Thomas Morgan, was last seen at the Eastfield station with her son Samuel. They were scheduled to depart for Chicago but never arrived. Authorities report no confirmed sightings since. The words hit him with a physical jolt. He leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. Lorraine L. Morgan. The name fit. The date matched the train ticket in the suitcase. He read the paragraph again, his eyes catching on the final sentence. The family of Mr. Morgan requests privacy during this time. That was all. No follow-up, no resolution, just an unfinished story sealed in a few lines of ink. Elijah sat back and let the weight of it sink in. The letter he had found was written by a woman who disappeared without trace, a woman whose name had slipped from memory until now. The suitcase left behind in an attic above an abandoned station had outlived every witness. It was the last survivor of a story that the world had forgotten. He printed the article from the library's website, the paper warm beneath his fingers. It felt strange to hold the digital in contrast to the physical, the cold precision of ink on new white pages against the aged softness of the letter and photograph. Yet, somehow, they belonged together, as though past and present were finally aligning. As night approached, he opened the suitcase once more, placing the newspaper clipping inside beside the letter. He looked at them both for a long time, as if waiting for them to speak to each other. He imagined Lorraine sitting at a table like his, pen in hand, sealing that envelope, knowing perhaps that she would never reach the train she meant to catch. He imagined the moment she might have turned back toward the station, suitcase in hand, when something, Fear, pursuit, a sudden decision forced her to stop. Elijah's thoughts drifted toward Thomas Morgan, the man who had remained behind. The husband who, according to the article, worked for the railway. He wondered if Thomas had kept his job after his wife and son vanished, if he had stood each day beside the very tracks that had taken them away, waiting for a train that would never bring them back. There was something unbearably human in that image, a man surrounded by the sound of departure, his own family swallowed by it. The next morning, Elijah drove to the public library. The woman behind the desk was gray-haired, with the gentle patience of someone who had spent her life among shelves. When he explained that he was looking for records related to the Morgans, she raised an eyebrow but offered no questions. She led him to a narrow hallway where old ledgers and microfilm reels were stored. The room smelled of dust and time. He spent hours there, the light flickering from the reader machine as he scrolled through faded archives. Each click of the reel felt like peeling back another layer of silence. There were scattered mentions of Thomas Morgan in work rosters and pay records, Railway Maintenance Division, employed from 1939 to 1943. Then, a final note, suspended pending investigation, October 1943. No further entries. He sat staring at the date, October, a month after the disappearance. It fit too neatly to be coincidence. Something had happened then, something that had silenced both the man and the woman. When the library closed, he walked out into the cooling air, the sky streaked with gold and gray. The city hummed faintly around him, but it felt distant, as though he were walking through layers of history that only he could see. Every street, every brick seemed haunted by echoes. He thought of Lorraine again, of the way her handwriting had flowed across the paper even as her world closed around her. The courage it must have taken to write such a letter. The quiet tragedy of it not reaching its destination. That night, Elijah dreamed differently. The station returned, but this time it was empty. No crowd, no smoke, no trains. Only the Suitcase, sitting alone on the platform, its surface glistening faintly as though damp from rain. In the dream, he approached it, knelt, and laid a hand on it. The moment his fingers touched the leather, he heard a voice behind him. Soft, low, the kind of voice that seemed to come from both near and far. "Find him," it said. He turned, but there was no one there. Only the faint shimmer of a lantern light fading into the fog. He woke before dawn, his heart racing. The house was silent except for the whisper of wind against the windows. He went to the table, turned on the lamp, and opened the suitcase again. The letter lay where he had left it, beside the photograph, the envelope's broken seal glinting faintly under the light. The boy's small wooden shoes rested nearby. The scene had not changed, and yet he felt as though the air around it had thickened, as if memory itself were stirring. He realized then that he could not stop. Whatever this was, curiosity, obsession, duty, it no longer mattered. He had to find the truth. He felt it like a pulse, guiding him. He took out a notebook and began to write. Lorraine Morgan, Thomas Morgan, Samuel Morgan, Eastfield Station, 1943. Beneath it, he added the words that had haunted him since the letter, tell him never to forget his name. He knew his next step. If Thomas had been a railway worker, there would be employment files somewhere. State archives, union records, perhaps even old correspondence. The investigation could not end in a paragraph from a forgotten newspaper. These people had lived, loved, suffered, vanished. They had names, and names deserved remembrance. As the first light of morning crept across the window, Elijah sat with the suitcase open beside him. The past spread before him like a map. The fog outside was lifting, and with it came a fragile sense of direction. Somewhere, he felt certain, traces remained. Documents, descendants, voices that would connect the fragments into something whole. He looked at the photograph again. The woman's eyes seemed to hold his now, as if asking him to continue. The child's small hand clutching the toy train seemed almost to move in the trembling light. And, for the first time since finding the suitcase, Elijah felt that he was no longer entirely alone. He placed the letter back inside, closed the lid gently, and rested his palm upon it. The leather was warm from his touch, and he felt an answering warmth, as though the past itself had acknowledged him. Outside, the morning train horn sounded from a distant line that had no reason to pass this way, and yet it came, soft and real in the pale light. He smiled faintly, not in disbelief but in recognition. The letter had never reached its destination, but perhaps that had never been its purpose. It had waited, patient as memory itself, for someone to open it, to read, to carry the message forward. Elijah understood that now. The story was not finished, and it had chosen him to finish it. He rose, took his coat, and stepped into the quiet morning. The air smelled faintly of rain. Behind him, in the stillness of the room, the suitcase sat on the table, the faint glint of its brass corners catching the dawn, holding within it the silence of all the words that had yet to be spoken. The following days unfolded in a quiet rhythm that no longer resembled the dull monotony of Elijah's former life. Each morning began the same. The faint gray light of dawn creeping across the room, the low murmur of wind against the windows, and the blue suitcase resting silently on the kitchen table as if it had taken root there. He no longer saw it as an object. It had become a companion, a witness, a vessel that waited for him to open it again each day. Inside lay not only the letters and photographs, but something intangible, an invitation, a demand to remember what others had forgotten. He could not stop thinking about Lorraine Morgan and her family. The photograph haunted him, especially the way the woman's face seemed both resigned and hopeful, as though she had sensed the fragility of the moment being captured. The little boy, Samuel, held his toy train, as if clinging to a future that might never arrive. Elijah often found himself tracing their outlines with his eyes, as though repetition could draw them closer, as though staring long enough might coax their story into revealing itself. The discovery of the newspaper article had given him a starting point, but no closure. The words "reported missing" carried a finality that felt wrong. It was too vague, too unfinished. Somewhere beyond that brief paragraph their story had continued, and he felt compelled to follow it. He began to plan his search with a kind of discipline he hadn't known he was capable of. The purpose steadied him, replacing the stagnant emptiness that had filled his days before. He started with the obvious, the railway. If Thomas Morgan had been employed there had to be records, personnel files, payroll logs, correspondence, something. The public library's archives had already hinted at a suspension in October of 1943, but that couldn't be the end. Elijah visited the city records office next, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Inside, time seemed to move slower, as if it too had settled into the weight of the past. Rows of filing cabinets lined the narrow corridors, their drawers labeled in neat, fade-in handwriting. He explained his purpose to a clerk, a man with thin gray hair and half-moon glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. The man listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Elijah finished, the clerk regarded him for a moment before saying, "You'll want the employment rolls, sir. We keep them on microfilm. There's a machine in the back room." He handed Elijah a key with a small brass tag attached. "Lock up when you're done. Not many come looking for this stuff anymore." The back room was dim and cool. A single fluorescent tube flickered overhead, casting the pale light of forgotten places. Elijah turned on the microfilm machine, the quiet whirring sound filling the room like a distant heartbeat. The reels held decades of records, names, and dates scrolling past in steady rhythm. His eyes burned from the constant focus, but he kept going, page after page, until finally he found it. Morgan, Thomas E., Railway Maintenance Division, Eastfield Station, hired 1939, suspended October 1943. Reason, pending internal investigation. He froze at those last words. An investigation into what? He turned the reel slowly, scanning for further notes, but the entries stopped abruptly. There were no explanations, no follow-up. It was as though the man had simply ceased to exist. Elijah leaned back in the chair and rubbed his eyes, exhaustion pressing at his temples. It was almost evening. The room smelled faintly of oil and paper, the scent of things that had been sealed away too long. He copied the entry by hand into his notebook and sat there for a while, staring at the blank space that followed the last recorded line of Thomas Morgan's life. Something about the abruptness of it unsettled him. An internal investigation during wartime could mean many things: dereliction, theft, political suspicion, even racial accusations in a country still poisoned by prejudice. He imagined a man trying to protect his family, caught between duty and something larger than himself, something cruel and faceless. The next day he returned to the archives, this time looking for local police records. The clerk on duty warned him that many files from that period had been lost to time, either destroyed in a flood decades earlier or simply misplaced. Still, Elijah persisted. He sifted through brittle pages and faded typewritten sheets, the smell of mildew thick in the air. The hours slipped by unnoticed until, near closing time, he found a fragment, an arrest ledger from October 1943, listing a Thomas Morgan detained for questioning in connection with unlawful railway activity. There were no further details, only the date and the name of the officer in charge. Elijah stared at the record in silence, his pulse quickening. Unlawful railway activity. The phrase was vague but heavy with implication. The more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. The letter Lorraine had written spoke of a journey north, of secrecy, of danger. Could Thomas have been a part of something larger, perhaps aiding others to escape, using his position on the railway to help them flee the South? If so, the investigation might not have been about misconduct at all, but defiance. He took a photograph of the ledger page and left the building just as the sun was setting. The air outside was warm. The last light of the day stretched across the horizon in streaks of gold and red. He stood on the steps of the courthouse and looked out across the town, feeling the weight of the discovery settle in his chest. It was not proof, not yet, but it was something. An echo of courage, a hint of a man who might have risked everything for the people he loved. Over the next week, Elijah's days became consumed with the search. He spent his mornings at the archives, his afternoons in the library, and his nights poring over what he had gathered. The suitcase, once an object of mystery, had now become a map. Each item pointed him in a direction. every fragment another piece of the mosaic he was assembling. He spoke with local historians, though few had any knowledge of the Morgans. One man, however, an elderly volunteer at the museum, recalled hearing stories as a child of a colored railway man who had vanished during the war years after being accused of helping people flee north. The man couldn't remember the name, but the details matched too closely to dismiss. They said he had a wife and a little boy, the old man told Elijah, his voice trembling slightly. Never saw them again either. Folks stopped talking about it after a while. People were afraid, you understand. Elijah nodded. He did understand, more than he wished to. Silence had always been a weapon in such stories, a way of erasing lives without blood. The thought filled him with quiet anger, not at anyone living, but at the long chain of fear and indifference that stretched across generations. That night, he returned home to the small house that had grown unfamiliar to him, as though he were now only a visitor passing through. He set the suitcase on the table and opened it again. The photograph lay on top, the edges beginning to curl. The faces stared back at him, patient, enduring. Beneath it, the letter rested in its envelope, fragile as breath. He ran his hand over the paper and whispered, "I'm still looking." The words felt strange in his mouth, but they steadied him. The next morning, Elijah decided to visit the remains of Eastfield Station. It had been closed for decades, the building left to rot on the outskirts of town, where the tracks ended in rust and weeds. The drive there was short, the road cracked and narrow, lined with oak trees that hung low over the asphalt. When he arrived, the station stood in ruin. Its roof half collapsed, windows shattered, the old platform overgrown with vines. Yet, even in decay, it held a kind of dignity, as though memory itself had refused to surrender. He stepped inside through a broken door. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of moss and rust. Dust floated in narrow beams of light that fell through holes in the ceiling. The echoes of his footsteps seemed impossibly loud. He imagined how it might have looked in 1943, crowded, noisy, filled with the hiss of steam and the clatter of luggage. Somewhere among those ghosts, Lorraine and her son had stood, perhaps only moments before everything changed. Elijah walked to the far end of the platform, where a faded sign still bore the station's name in flaking white letters. Below it, the tracks disappeared into tall grass. He knelt and touched the rail, its surface rough and pitted. For a brief second, he felt the same shiver he had felt when he first opened the suitcase, the sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by time itself. He stayed there until the light began to fade, listening to the wind move through the broken windows. When he finally rose, he noticed something half buried near the edge of the platform, a small, rusted metal tag. He pried it loose and turned it over in his hand. The letters were nearly illegible, but with effort he made them out. E.F. Station, Property, 1943. It was nothing more than a fragment, a piece of the past that had survived by accident, yet holding it filled him with a strange sense of connection. Driving home that night, Elijah felt the fatigue of the day settle into his bones, but beneath it pulsed something deeper, a resolve, a quiet certainty that he had crossed some invisible threshold. He was no longer simply searching for information. He was retracing the footsteps of lives that had vanished, walking paths they could not finish. When he returned home, the house felt warmer than usual, though he had left no lights on. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. He set the tag beside the suitcase and sat in silence, staring at the objects gathered before him. Each was a fragment of a life, but together they began to form the outline of a story, A family torn apart by fear and faith, a man punished for doing what was right, a woman who tried to escape and disappeared into the folds of history. He thought of his own grandfather then, of the old stories that had never been told, of the silences that hung in his own family like unspoken prayers. Could there be a connection? The idea flickered through his mind, but seemed too fragile to grasp. Still, something deep within him stirred at the thought. He felt as if he were being drawn not just toward the Morgans, but toward his own buried origins. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the windows. Elijah rose, poured himself a glass of water, and stood watching the droplets slide down the glass. The reflection of the suitcase shimmered behind him, its brass corners catching the dim glow of the street light. He thought of Lorraine's final words in her letter. Tell him never to forget his name. The echo of that sentence seemed to fill the room, soft but insistent. He turned from the window and looked once more at the suitcase. It no longer seemed merely to contain the past. It seemed to be leading him through it. Somewhere, beyond the reach of these quiet walls, the rest of their story waited. He knew now that he would not stop until he found it. The fog of his own life, the emptiness that had defined his days, had lifted. In its place was a path, uncertain, difficult, but real. As he turned off the light and prepared for bed, he glanced back toward the table. The suitcase sat in shadow, silent as always, yet it seemed to hum faintly in the stillness, a low vibration at the edge of hearing. Elijah smiled faintly, though he didn't know why. It felt as if the world had begun to move again, as if the invisible machinery of destiny, long dormant, had creaked back to life. He lay in bed, listening to the rain until sleep claimed him, and when he dreamed it was not of loss or fear, but of a train gliding smoothly through the night. Its lights cut through the darkness, and in one of the carriages he thought he saw a woman holding a small boy by the hand. The boy turned toward the window and looked out, his face illuminated by passing light. In that instant, Elijah understood that the past was not gone. It was only waiting for someone to find the way back. The next morning arrived shrouded in mist so dense that the horizon seemed to dissolve into the air itself. The town was quiet, subdued, as if holding its breath. Elijah stood at the window of his small house, watching the vapor creep over the street and blur the outlines of the trees. The glass was cool under his fingertips, and his reflection looked strange, half erased, almost spectral. It suited the way he felt. The night's dream still clung to him. The train gliding through the dark, the woman's calm silhouette, the boy's face pressed to the window. He had awoken with the strange certainty that the dream wasn't fantasy, but something remembered, borrowed from the past. The suitcase remained where it always did, on the table by the window. He had not touched it since returning from Eastfield Station, yet it seemed to have grown heavier in its stillness, as if it absorbed the weight of every new discovery. Each day he lived among its contents felt like sharing a house with invisible guests. He had learned much about Thomas's work, Lorraine's disappearance, the possibility that the railway itself had been the line between their safety and their ruin. But the knowledge had not brought him closer to peace. Instead, it deepened the mystery, as though the truth, once glimpsed, receded further into shadow. He ate breakfast mechanically, unable to taste it. The rhythm of ordinary life, the kettle, the scraping of toast, the soft hum of the refrigerator, had become background noise to a single driving purpose. He needed to return to the station, not to search through rubble again, but to listen. Something about that place still called to him, not with words, but with presence. He wanted to walk the tracks, to see where they led. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the mist had thinned but not lifted. It clung to the trees in pale ribbons and drifted over the fields like breath. The old railway road stretched ahead of him, its surface cracked and littered with gravel. Birds scattered from the bushes as his footsteps echoed through the still air. The remnants of Eastfield Station emerged slowly through the haze, its decaying platform jutting out like the rib of a shipwreck. The silence here was profound, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ruined roof and the whisper of wind moving through weeds. Elijah stepped carefully over the threshold. The same scent greeted him: damp earth, rust, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender. It was the same scent that had escaped the suitcase when he first opened it. He paused in the main hall, where the cracked tiles were mottled with moss and the faded timetable still hung askew on the wall. The words were nearly erased, the paper eaten by mildew, but he could make out faint numbers: September 1943, beneath the grime. The sight made his chest tighten. He walked slowly toward the platform, his boots stirring dust. The tracks stretched into the distance, swallowed by overgrown grass, their metal faintly gleaming where the mist touched them. He crouched beside the rails and ran his hand along the cold surface. The steel was rough beneath his fingers, pitted with rust, yet it carried a kind of hum. He thought of how many trains had once passed over it, carrying strangers and soldiers, families and lovers. Each journey had left its echo behind, a faint vibration lodged in the bones of the earth. He sat there for a long time, listening. The wind shifted through the tall grass, and in the faint murmur of movement he could almost hear the rhythm of an approaching train, the hiss of steam, the distant clang of wheels. The sound came and went like a heartbeat, and for an instant he thought he could smell smoke. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only silence. He stood and wandered down the platform, following the curve of the tracks until the station was only a shadow behind him. The land here dipped toward a small ravine, and beyond it he saw the remains of what must once have been a storage shed. Its wooden frame leaned precariously, one wall collapsed inward. Inside, he found nothing but debris: splintered boards, rusted bolts, a few scraps of metal. Yet, near the corner of the shed, buried under a thin layer of soil, his boot struck something solid. He knelt, brushing the dirt away until his hand closed around a glass bottle sealed with a cork. The bottle was small, clouded with age, and inside was a rolled piece of paper tied with a thread. His pulse quickened. The cork came loose with a faint pop, and he carefully drew out the note. The paper was brittle but legible. It was written in the same steady hand he had come to recognize, Lorraine's handwriting. The ink had faded, but the words still carried their voice across the years. September 21st, 1943. The train was delayed again. They say the tracks ahead are not safe, that men have been arrested. Thomas told me not to worry, but I can see it in his face. He fears more than he says. Samuel is tired. If we cannot leave tonight, we will try tomorrow. I will hide this note here in case we do not return. Maybe one day someone will know we were here. Elijah read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. The discovery sent a shiver through him that was not entirely from the cold. It was proof that Lorraine had reached the station, that she had written those last words perhaps hours before she vanished. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. He could almost see her, kneeling in the dark corner of the shed, glancing over her shoulder as she slipped the note into the bottle, unaware that it would remain buried for 80 years. The mist thickened again as he made his way back toward the platform. The air was heavy with moisture, and the silence had deepened into something almost tangible. He stopped near the spot where the tracks disappeared into the trees and stood still, listening. Somewhere beyond the veil of fog, he thought he heard a faint sound, a low metallic groan, followed by the whisper of movement. It could have been the wind, he told himself, but it felt different, deeper, more deliberate. He turned toward the sound, and for a moment the fog seemed to part. He saw the faint outline of a train, a dark shape gliding silently along the tracks, its windows dimly lit, the outline shimmering as if reflected on water. It moved slowly, impossibly, and through one of the windows he thought he saw faces. A woman, a child. The vision flickered, fading even as he blinked. Then it was gone, the mist closing over the tracks once more. He stood frozen, his breath visible in the cool air. He knew what he had seen, or thought he had, and yet it didn't frighten him. Instead, he felt an overwhelming calm, as though the past itself had risen to meet him for a moment, to acknowledge his search. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." The air trembled softly in response, and then there was only quiet. When he returned home later that evening, his clothes were damp with mist and his shoes carried the scent of earth. He set the bottle on the table beside the suitcase and sat down, exhausted. The letter inside the bottle seemed to complete something, to fill a space that had been waiting all along. The story was still incomplete, but now he had proof that Lorraine's final hours had unfolded at the station, that she and her son had been there together. He opened the suitcase again, arranging the items with deliberate care. The photograph, the letter to Thomas, the train ticket, the small shoes, and now the newly found note. Each piece lay in its place, forming a silent conversation across decades. He stared at them until his eyes blurred, then leaned back in his chair. The house was still. Even the ticking of the clock seemed subdued, as if time itself had slowed to match his thoughts. That night, he dreamed of the station again. But this time it was whole, alive with people and sound. The air smelled of coal and steam, and voices echoed across the platform. He saw Lorraine standing near the pillar, her suitcase beside her, Samuel holding tightly to her hand. She looked straight at him, her expression calm, her eyes filled with quiet strength. Behind her, the train waited, its doors open. She didn't speak, but he understood. She was not asking to be saved, she was waiting to be remembered. The whistle blew, and the scene dissolved into darkness. Elijah woke with tears on his face. The dream had felt less like a vision and more like a farewell. He sat up, breathing heavily, and turned on the lamp. The suitcase glowed faintly in the soft light, its presence both comforting and heavy. He realized then that he could no longer keep this story to himself. It was not his to hoard. The Morgans deserved more than to be confined to a stranger's table. Their story needed to live again in the world. He began making plans that morning. The archives had given him enough names to trace the possibility of surviving relatives. The idea both excited and terrified him. What if they didn't want to know? What if he was reopening wounds that time had allowed to close? But the thought of silence was worse. Silence was how people vanished forever. The following week became a blur of phone calls, emails, and unanswered messages. He reached out to local historical societies, genealogical groups, anyone who might know the Morgans' descendants. Most replies were polite but unhelpful, fragments of information without clarity. Still, Elijah persisted. The search had ceased to be merely an act of curiosity. It was a form of devotion now, an offering to the past. One evening, as he sat surrounded by notes and photocopies, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was hesitant, elderly, and carried a soft southern cadence. "You were looking for information about a Lorraine Morgan?" the woman asked. Elijah's heart jumped. "Yes," he said quickly. "Do you know something about her?" There was a pause before she answered. "My grandmother used to speak of her, said she was her cousin. A brave woman, they said, though no one knew what became of her. Why are you asking?" He explained as best he could about the suitcase, the letters, the photograph. The line was silent for a long moment, and he thought the call had dropped. Then the woman spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you should come and see me. I have something you might want to look at." She gave him an address 2 towns over. When the call ended, Elijah sat motionless, the receiver still in his hand. The mist outside the window had lifted, and the first stars were visible against the indigo sky. He set the phone down and looked toward the suitcase. The brass clasps caught the lamplight, gleaming faintly. It felt as though the air around it had changed, lightened somehow, as if the story itself were exhaling after being held too long in silence. He packed the suitcase carefully the next morning, placing each item inside as though preparing it for a journey. As he fastened the clasps, he thought of the vision at the station, the woman and child in the ghostly train. Maybe that had been their way of showing him the next step. Maybe the journey wasn't over, but only changing direction. Outside, the morning was clear and bright for the first time in days. The mist was gone, replaced by sharp sunlight that turned the wet grass to silver. Elijah carried the suitcase to the car and paused for a moment before getting in. He looked back at the house, the quiet rooms, the window where the suitcase had rested for so long, and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and melancholy. It had all begun here, in stillness and confusion. Now he was ready to carry it forward. As he drove toward the horizon, the town faded behind him, replaced by open road and the wide expanse of sky. He did not know exactly what awaited him at the other end, only that he could not turn back. The truth was waiting, just as Lorraine and Thomas had once waited at that station, their lives suspended between departure and arrival. And, as the miles passed beneath his tires, Elijah felt, for the first time in years, that he was no longer merely existing. He was traveling toward something, following the faint rhythm of rails that still sang beneath the surface of time. The drive out of town took Elijah through stretches of farmland that seemed endless beneath the pale morning sky. The sun was low, its light cutting through a thin layer of haze that hung over the fields like memory itself, distant and half-formed. The road curved lazily through the countryside, past leaning barns, empty porches, and the occasional weathered billboard that still bore traces of paint, long since faded by rain and wind. The rhythmic hum of the car engine was steady and low, a sound that carried both calm and tension. He had not felt so alert in years. Every mile seemed to draw him deeper into the pull of the story, into a place where past and present began to blur. He thought of the phone call, of the woman's voice, trembling yet certain when she had said she remembered Lorraine Morgan. There had been something about her tone, something reverent, as though the name carried more than family connection. Elijah couldn't help imagining what she might look like. Perhaps white-haired, small, wrapped in the quiet dignity of age. He wondered what something to show could mean. A letter? A photograph? Maybe even another piece of that vanished family's life preserved by accident. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, afraid of the hope that rose too quickly in his chest. The house stood at the end of a long gravel road that cut through an expanse of overgrown pasture. It was an old farmhouse, its white paint peeling in places, its porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. The fields around it were dotted with wildflowers, their colors faint beneath the sunlight. A figure stood waiting on the porch. A woman, tall and slender despite her age, her gray hair pulled back in a simple knot. When Elijah stepped out of the car, she didn't wave or call out. She simply waited, as if she had known for a long time that this moment would come. He approached slowly, the suitcase in his hand, feeling both like a visitor and an intruder. The boards of the porch creaked beneath his shoes. The woman studied him closely, her eyes sharp, alive with something that reminded him of Lorraine's gaze in the photograph. "You must be Mr. Bennett," she said softly, her voice low and steady. "I'm Evelyn Harris. Come in out of the sun." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The front room was filled with the quiet clutter of memory. Shelves lined with framed photographs, small keepsakes, a grandfather clock whose pendulum moved with slow precision. Evelyn led him to a wooden table near the window. "You said you had found something," she began, gesturing for him to sit. "Something of Lorraine's." Elijah placed the suitcase on the table and unlatched it carefully, as though performing a ritual. When he lifted the lid, the faint scent of aged leather and lavender filled the air. Evelyn leaned closer, her eyes widening slightly as she saw what lay inside. The photograph, the letter, the train ticket, the little shoes, all of it arranged with care. For a long moment, she said nothing. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch the edge of the photograph. "I've seen this before," she whispered finally. Her voice had changed, softened into something fragile. "My grandmother had a copy. It hung on her wall when I was a child, though she never spoke much about it. Just said they were family who'd gone north and never returned." She looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. That was Lorraine. And the boy, Samuel. I used to stare at that picture for hours, wondering what happened to them. Elijah felt the weight of her words settle over the room. It was as if history itself had reached out through bloodlines and found its voice. "I found the suitcase at a flea market," he said quietly. "It was tucked under a pile of tools, half forgotten. I didn't know what it was at first, but when I opened it, I couldn't leave it alone. I needed to know who they were." Evelyn nodded slowly, still staring at the photograph. "My grandmother never stopped talking about the past, but when it came to Lorraine, her voice would change. She'd get quiet, almost afraid. I think she knew more than she ever told anyone." She traced the face of the child in the photo with her fingertip. "She used to say, 'There are things this family owes the dead,' truth being one of them. I never understood it until now." She rose from the table and crossed the room to a tall cabinet. From a drawer she pulled a small bundle wrapped in linen and tied with a faded ribbon. "I didn't know why I kept this all these years," she said as she returned to the table. "Maybe I was waiting for someone like you." Inside the bundle was another photograph, smaller, darker with age. It showed a young man standing beside a railway car, his uniform neat, his cap tucked under one arm. His expression was solemn but proud. The name written in elegant cursive along the bottom read Thomas E. Morgan, 1942. Elijah stared at it in silence. The resemblance to the man in the earlier photo was unmistakable. "There's more," Evelyn said softly. She unwrapped another layer of the bundle and revealed a folded sheet of paper, its edges frayed. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was legible. Elijah unfolded it with care and began to read. It was addressed to my dearest Lorraine. The letter was dated October 3rd, 1943, less than 2 weeks after Lorraine's own final message. The words struck Elijah with the same force as a voice carried across time. My dearest Lorraine, they have taken everything from me but my will. They questioned me for days about the trains, about the people I helped. I told them I would rather lose my life than betray those who trusted me. They call it unlawful. I call it mercy. I don't know where you are or if you're safe, but I pray that one day these words will find you. If not you, then our boy. Tell him I never forgot the sound of his laughter. Tell him I never stopped believing the world could be better than this. If the world should ever remember us, let it be for love, not fear. Thomas. Elijah read the letter aloud, his voice trembling. When he finished, silence filled the room like a living thing. Evelyn's eyes were closed, her lips moving as if she were praying. So it was true, she whispered. He was helping people escape. My grandmother hinted at it once, said he used the trains to send families north. Colored families, sometimes mixed, sometimes running from the violence that waited for them. It wasn't just about war. It was about freedom. The revelation struck Elijah like a slow wave of light spreading through darkness. It wasn't simply a story of disappearance now, but of defiance, of courage hidden beneath tragedy. He thought of the letter Lorraine had left, her plea for safety, her faith that they would find their way north. And he thought of Thomas, arrested for doing what conscience demanded, writing his last words from a cell or a hiding place. Their love had not been ordinary, it had been the kind that left its mark on history, even if history refused to remember. Evelyn opened a drawer and withdrew a small, framed clipping. This was in the paper a few years after the war ended, she said, handing it to him. The headline read, Missing Railway Worker Presumed Dead. The brief article recounted Thomas Morgan's disappearance after his release from custody. There were rumors of his death in an accident along the Northern Line, though no body had ever been found. My grandmother always said he never died, Evelyn murmured. She said he just kept going north. Elijah sat back, absorbing it all. He looked at the two photographs, the family together on the platform and Thomas alone beside his train, and felt a strange stillness come over him. The suitcase between them no longer seemed like a mystery box, but a bridge, connecting two worlds divided by silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I think Lorraine never made it north. Her note was buried near the station. She must have waited for him, maybe hoping he would come for them. Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. And he did, she said softly. In his way, he gave everything to make sure others could escape. Maybe he believed she had gone ahead, that she was safe. They both lived for hope, and hope can be cruel. The sun had dipped lower by then, its light slanting through the window, catching the dust in the air. For a long while they sat in silence, listening to the distant sound of cicadas. It felt like a vigil. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. You've given me something I didn't know I was waiting for, she said. Closure, maybe, or forgiveness. She looked at him with a faint, weary smile. What will you do now? Elijah stared at the suitcase, its worn leather surface glowing softly in the evening light. I'll return it, he said, to the family, to you. It belongs with you more than it ever did with me. Evelyn reached across the table and laid a hand over his. Her palm was warm, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. "You brought them home," she said. "Not just the suitcase, but their story. You did what none of us could." When Elijah left the house later that night, the air was cool and filled with the hum of crickets. The stars had begun to appear, faint at first, then sharper against the deepening blue. He carried the suitcase back to the car, but before opening the door, he paused to look back at the house. Evelyn stood in the doorway, framed by the warm light behind her, the photograph of Lorraine and Thomas in her hands. She raised it slightly, as though in farewell. He nodded, unable to speak. The drive back was long and quiet. The fields stretched out beneath the moonlight, silver and endless. As he followed the winding road, he thought about what he had learned, about the power of remembrance, the way love could persist through silence and fear. The road shimmered faintly under the moon, and for a moment he thought he saw the outline of rails beside it, running parallel through the night. He imagined a train gliding there, unseen, carrying with it all the ghosts of stories that had refused to die. When he reached home, he set the suitcase gently on the table one last time. The room was filled with soft moonlight, the air cool and still. He opened the lid and looked at its contents. Everything felt different now, no longer relics of mystery, but relics of devotion. The silence that once pressed on him now felt peaceful, like the quiet after a long journey. He closed the lid slowly, his hand lingering on the leather. "You're home now," he whispered. The words seemed to echo softly through the room, absorbed into the stillness. Outside, a distant train whistle sounded faintly, carried on the wind, a sound from nowhere and everywhere at once. Elijah stood listening until it faded. Then he turned off the light and let the night take him, knowing the story was no longer his to carry alone, but had finally found its way back to where it belonged. Dawn broke over the horizon with a pale light that spread slowly across the quiet streets, softening the sharp lines of rooftops and trees. Elijah stood by the window, motionless, his reflection faint against the glass. The night had been long and restless, his mind circling endlessly around the faces that had come to occupy his thoughts, the determined eyes of Thomas, the weary grace of Lorraine, and the innocent smile of their boy. The world outside was waking, but inside he felt suspended between times, the boundaries of decades thinning until he could almost sense their presence in the room. The suitcase rested on the table once more, closed but no longer heavy with mystery. It had become something else entirely, a vessel of connection, a bridge across time that had carried both burden and grace. Evelyn's face had stayed with him since the evening before, her trembling hands clutching the photograph, her eyes shining with the mingled sorrow and peace of recognition. Her voice, soft but steady, still echoed in his ears. "You brought them home." The words had followed him into his dreams, resonating with a quiet finality that felt like the closing of a long open circle. He had promised to return the suitcase, but now that the moment was near, he felt a strange reluctance. It wasn't ownership that made it hard to let go, it was the bond. The story had become part of him, reshaping his days and nights, pulling him out of the gray stillness that had once filled his life. He had come to see it not as coincidence but as purpose. The suitcase had found him for a reason, and in finding it, he had rediscovered himself. The morning light deepened, and with it came clarity. He packed the suitcase carefully, ensuring each item rested as it had when he first found it. The photograph atop the folded clothes, the letter beneath it, the small shoes tucked gently beside the train ticket. Every motion felt ceremonial, a quiet act of farewell. When he closed the clasps, they clicked softly, like a lock turning on the past. He lifted the case and felt its familiar weight, lighter now, but still charged with the memory it carried. The drive to Evelyn's home took him through winding roads edged by oaks and wild grasses shimmering in the early sun. The day was clear, the sky an unbroken expanse of pale blue. As he approached the farmhouse, he noticed the window curtains stirring gently in the breeze. The world seemed momentarily still, as if pausing in respect for what was about to pass between them. Evelyn met him at the door before he could knock. Her face, though lined with age, carried an expression of calm resolution. "You came," she said, as though she had known he would. He nodded, holding the suitcase out slightly. "I thought it should rest where it belongs." She stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. The same faint scent of cedar filled the air, mingled now with the aroma of fresh coffee. On the table lay the photograph she had shown him the night before, the image of Thomas in his uniform. She had placed a small vase beside it, holding a single white lily. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted as they sat. "I kept thinking about them, about how many years passed with no one knowing. My grandmother carried that silence all her life. It's strange, isn't it, how truth can outlast the people who lived it." Elijah set the suitcase on the table and opened it one final time. The light from the window caught the edges of the photograph, making it gleam. Evelyn's breath caught softly as she reached out and touched the folded letter. "So much of them in so little space," she murmured. "It's like holding the echo of their lives." He told her then about the station, the ruins, the mist, the hidden note he had found in the glass bottle. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened, but she did not interrupt. When he finished, she smiled faintly through the grief. "She waited there," she said softly. "Even when the world turned against her, she waited. And somehow, even after all this time, she found her way back through you." They sat in silence for a while, the suitcase open between them like an altar. Outside, a train horn sounded faintly in the distance, its long note cutting through the quiet fields. The sound carried both melancholy and beauty, and for a moment neither spoke. When the echo faded, Evelyn rose and walked to the cabinet where she kept her family records. She pulled out a worn leather album and brought it to the table. The pages crackled as she opened it. Photographs, yellowed with age, filled the pages, faces that resembled those in the suitcase, generations of Morgans captured in their time. She turned to a page near the end and slipped the photograph of Lorraine, Thomas, and Samuel into an empty sleeve. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment before she closed the cover gently. "There," she said. "Now they're home." Elijah felt something inside him ease, a tension he hadn't realized he was still carrying. The suitcase, once a burden of questions, had completed its purpose. He closed it carefully and placed it on the floor beside her chair. Evelyn looked at it for a long time, her expression a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. "You know," she said quietly, "stories like theirs don't end when we stop telling them. They rest for a while, waiting for someone to listen again." He nodded. "I think I understand that now." They spoke for hours that day, about Lorraine and Thomas, about the war, about the long chain of silence that had followed their disappearance. Evelyn told him of her grandmother's resilience, how she had raised her children with quiet pride despite what had been lost. There were small details, too, glimpses of ordinary life. A handmade quilt, a song hummed in the evenings, a box of letters burned long ago for peace. Every word added a color to the story, filling in the spaces time had erased. As the afternoon waned, the light turned golden, spilling across the wooden floor. Elijah stood to leave, and Evelyn followed him to the porch. The fields beyond shimmered in the late sun, their shadows stretching long. "Will you write about them?" she asked. He hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe, but not just about them. About all of it. The suitcase, the silence, the way memory survives." Evelyn nodded approvingly. "Then you'll do what they could not. You'll make sure they're never forgotten." He promised her he would. Then, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he said goodbye and began the drive home. The road glowed with the last light of day, the world bathed in a warm amber haze. He drove with the windows down, the air filled with the hum of cicadas and the faint echo of distant rails. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Back home, the house felt different, emptier, but in a way that was gentle rather than lonely. The space on the table where the suitcase had always sat was now bare, and yet the absence felt alive, filled with quiet presence. He brewed coffee and sat by the window as night settled outside. The stars appeared slowly, one by one, until the sky was dusted with their faint silver light. He thought about how it had all begun. An idle morning at a flea market, a worn leather suitcase half hidden beneath forgotten things. He remembered the first touch of its surface, the strange pull it had exerted on him, the voice that seemed to whisper through its silence. He had thought it was chance then, but now he knew better. Some stories are not found, they find you. The clock ticked softly in the corner, marking time not as an enemy, but as an ally. He reached for his notebook, the same one he had used to jot down names and dates when his search began. On the first empty page, he wrote the title, "The Morgans of Eastfield Station." Beneath it, a single line, a story of love that waited 80 years to be heard. As he wrote, words came easily, flowing as if dictated by the voices he had come to know. He described the station, the scent of rust and rain, the echo of trains that no longer ran. He described Lorraine's courage, Thomas's faith, the quiet strength that had bound them together through absence and time. And he wrote about the boy, Samuel, the symbol of what they had hoped for, a future where memory would not fade. Hours passed unnoticed. When he finally put the pen down, dawn was beginning again, soft light creeping across the floor. He closed the notebook and sat back, exhausted but content. The air felt different, lighter. The past had finally been given its due, and in doing so, it had freed him too. Outside, as morning rose, a train whistle sounded faintly in the distance. He smiled, knowing it was just a modern freight line, but part of him believed it was something more. He stood at the window, watching the horizon, and whispered, "You made it home." The sound faded into the open air, leaving only the hush of the wakened world. Yet the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of love remembered, of voices reclaimed, of lives no longer lost to time. And as the first light of the new day washed over the town, Elijah felt that he too had returned home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. We have more unbelievable true stories waiting for you. Hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.